talk. Let's hope we can talk, right? Because that's why we're here. But what we would like to do, and we've talked about this beforehand, is we would like to carry on something of a conversation at the beginning amongst ourselves. I will be standing back at that point and letting these folks talk about some things. And then after a little bit, we'd like to open it up to all of you. So if you have a comment or a question, please just raise your hand, and I will try to be as fair as possible and actually choosing you, making sure everyone gets a chance to talk.
I'm going to talk a little bit about suicide from a mental health perspective, because I've had over 25 years of experience working in the field of mental health all over the world, including Europe. And I want to talk a little bit about some statistics, and I'm going to break one of his rules. And and I'm going to I want you to answer some questions when I'm talking about the statistics and see if you have that correct. What age range do you think has the highest rate of suicide in the United States?
Ideation or completion?
Completion.
65,
Sorry.
65 and over.
40.
Right. 65 and over?
40 then.
Who? Anybody else?
40s and 50s.
Yeah.
White males,
Middle-aged
That's
male.
So she's given one statistic is disproportionately represented by white males, and the age range is between 45 and 65, and then the next highest is 82 and above.
Wow.
So, and we tend to think, oh, teenagers are impulsive, they're the ones who kill themselves. That's not true. They actually are the lowest. So what ethnic group do you think constitutes the highest level of suicide?
Caucasian.
Native American.
Oh, they're number 3. That goes with them. It's all cool.
Don't listen.
Yes, they're high. It's white men. And what ethnic group has the lowest rate?
African American.
And African American females. It's kind of interesting, you know, having worked in the field, and I've had a couple of clients who completed suicide, and if you work in it long enough, it's gonna happen, not because of anything you didn't do or you were a bad therapist, but because it's a very real product of mental illness. A lot of times people say, well, suicide is a condition, but it's actually a behavior, and the diagnosis that I've seen that is most prevalent in those people who either have attempted or completed over the years, and it's also in the CDC information, is that they have some type of mood disorder, depression. They also have a history of schizophrenia and substance abuse. So those are the ones the type of disorders that you find most often with people who either attempt or complete. Suicide constitutes the 3rd highest condition behind cancer and heart disease that where numbers of years of life lost are constituted, which is really, I didn't know that until I read the CDC information. I thought it was somewhere down there, and I think someone said this morning that it's the 10th leading, the 8th leading cause of death in the United States, but it really is the 10th leading. And what's happened is interesting, and I guess you can look at economics, you can look at anything if you want to, but over the years between 1986 and the 2013, because they haven't collected all the data for 14, so this is 2013 data. Between the years of 2000 and 2010, there was a steady decline in the number of people who suicide in the United States. But after 2010, it started going up, and it has steadily increased. So it's kind of an interesting, but I mean, data, I like data. I have a boss who likes data, but it really does help us understand the nature of suicidal behavior and what we have to deal with as clinicians. And we'll talk more about it, and I don't want to take a lot of time, but I think it's important to set a foundation in understanding the nature of suicide and where we go from here.
Do you mind if I piggyback on that?
Yeah,
And just
yeah.
continue the clinical side for a minute?
Uh-huh.
Some of the most salient risk factors for somebody attempting or completing suicide are a recent loss of a job or a long-term relationship, marriage, or death of a partner. In the case of older white males in particular, the death of a spouse and widowhood is a really, really big risk factor. For men who have worked for many, many years, and this is probably more common in the older generation currently than, say, mine, well, just because companies are no longer loyal to their employees the way they used to be, let's be honest. The folks who dedicated 20, 30, or 40 years to one job and then were either forced into retirement or left that position often feel like they have nothing left in life. You know, their identity was wrapped up in their employment and their authority, and now that that's gone, there's a hole that's hard to fill. Substance abuse, as Teresa mentioned, is another humongous risk factor. Alcohol is involved in a tremendous portion of suicide attempts and completed suicides in the United States. Mental illness is the #1 correlating factor, typically behind almost every suicide. I mean, an enormous percentage that I don't have memorized. There is a case of depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. These are huge markers for that. Somebody who has in the past attempted suicide is at elevated risk for trying again. And of course, the more frequently you try, the more likely it is that something will go wrong. And I will say wrong in this case because no matter what the goal is at the moment, suicide is not something you succeed at. It's not something you do well. It's something that is always a tragedy. One of the things that I had read recently, and this ran counter to our initial discussion, and this came off of the suicide prevention website, not CDC, is that it is not just modeled behaviorally, as a culture, we see Robin Williams has taken his life, and that somehow gives us this sense of permission, or that's an escape avenue we can take when we're desperate, which does happen. But also families through generations tend to show patterns of suicides. So genograms of clients done who are suffering from depression or who had family members who took their own lives will probably demonstrate that this has happened more than once, maybe across several generations, and your client would therefore be at elevated risk. And that's something that's really important to find out. There's also apparently a biological predisposition that I didn't know about until very recently. Twin studies, when identical twins and even fraternal twins are born and then adopted by separate families, raised in different areas of the country even, there is a greater propensity for those whose twin has committed suicide to follow and attempt or commit suicide as well. So this is something that is very much a mental illness, and the same thing that any other mental illness is. You know, it's got the genetic predisposition along the lines of, say, schizophrenia, alcoholism, or depression, societal factors like the loss of your job, your sense of identity, social support, and relationships. And it really is something that we need to be willing to address as a whole, as a society, not pigeonholing a certain characteristic. Say, you've got tattoos, you're 22 years old, you're impulsive, you use heroin. It's a big issue. It affects all of us.
And one thing I just want to add to that is that if you look at the predispositions and the contagion, if that's what you want to call it, like
Social
Robin
contagion.
Williams, in the study that you're talking about, they also acknowledged that the root cause, which is genetic, is that a lot of if you have a genetic predisposition to depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and it's happened, that behavior is modeled for you, then you're more likely, does that make sense? To engage in some suicidal behavior and commit suicide. Okay.
I mean, I think these type of things that we're talking about right here, I think make, the work that we do, and that you and I do, ever more important because, while we talk with a lot of people, very often we don't have, the tools that you have at your, in the world of mental health there. So very often, if someone were to come into me and the red light goes off, they say, well, I really have no reason to live, or I think I'm thinking of taking my life. It's like the first thing to do is to say, okay, let's push the pause on this conversation here, because we really need to find, a way that someone, you can talk with someone in order to prevent what the next step might be. So, I mean, I don't know if we want to stay there for a couple of minutes and just talk about that.
Yeah,
Because we're very often, among the people who get to hear this for the first time, there's another time that we're interacting with families, and that's after either a suicide attempt or, as you said, someone completes
yeah, and I think that there's that thing about, I don't care how many times they've come in to me and said, I think I'm going to commit suicide. I take that very seriously.
Mhm.
That's right.
And having worked for 20 years with family and friends, let me tell you, it's very difficult to live after you've said, oh, well, they don't really mean it. It becomes very difficult for the survivors to cope with that sort of feeling. So whenever you hear it, let's us go right now. It's not, let me call mental health and get your appointment in a week. No, it's you and me in the car and we're going to get some help. I'm not an expert in stopping suicide. There are people who do that, and so my job is to help you get to that person. And the other thing is, and this is sort of the title of this thing, we need to be able to talk about this openly. One of the things that happens is the number of people who have told me this who were in my group. I did not know how many people have experienced a suicide. But you only find out about it after you've lost somebody to suicide, and then they come and say, I truly know how you feel. My uncle took his life. But that's a secret. It's sort of a secret society that you don't reveal. And we need to be able to talk about this openly so we can deal with both the emotions of the people who are thinking about suicide and the folks who are left.
Well, I'm a part of a Chapel Hill group, a triangle group, Faith Connections on Mental Illness, and once a month we get educated. And a couple months ago we had Jody Height, social work at Chapel Hill, on suicide prevention, and she said something that I've really embraced. She said, let's change the language, that people don't die, commit suicide, they die from suicide. Now that just changes my mindset. And secondly, for our faith communities, I think we need some education beforehand. I remember I grew up, went to Sunday school all my life, didn't know anything about the civil rights movement. My husband marched with Martin Luther King Jr., but here I was in seminary and I never heard there was a race problem. So I think the church, Martin Luther King Jr. said, the church, in this case the church, excuse me, but this was his quote, that it's too often the tail light and not the headlight. So I think education before some of these events that will occur in our faith communities would be very helpful to the whole community.
Barbara Vaughn, and I'm a therapist in private practice in Greensboro. And I work with those who have attempted suicide and also those who have experienced the aftermath. Refer to your group. Thank you for starting that. When I think about suicide, I think about two sides of the coin. One is the person who's contemplating taking their life and all that's going on, whether it's mental illness or recent loss or whatever. And then I think about what happens for the family and what they go through afterwards. And the one word that keeps coming to mind for me is hope. They've lost hope. For whatever reason, it doesn't matter which side of the coin, they're looking for hope. The person that's contemplating that is looking for hope and a purpose to continue going through whatever pain they feel that they're going through. And those who have lost somebody to suicide, that there's some kind of hope that they can let go of some of the guilt and suffering that they have, whether they believe they're going to see somebody in the afterlife, or that they can put to rest this person had a good life on earth, and that I was a part of helping that happen.